welcome. Thank you so much for joining the Fleet Science Center for one of our crossover panels, because we're crossing over pop culture with science. The Fleet Science Center is a science museum in San Diego. We're a nonprofit organization. And our mission is to connect everybody in San Diego with the power and possibilities of science to create a better world. And I do hope that with this panel, we're going to branch out of the San Diego region and going to go maybe worldwide. I'm going to dream big here. I'm going to dream that this video is going to be seen all over the world, and I'm very excited. Pop culture features a lot of science. Not everybody is aware of it, but when you look at superhero movies or superhero comics, there's normally a lab accident that went wrong, and all of a sudden they have these amazing superpowers. So we want to explore that a little bit further, and hopefully get people not only excited about new stories in pop culture, like the book series we're going to discuss today, but also about science and how science plays a role every day in all of our lives in every aspect. All right, with that, I'm going to take it away, and we're going to introduce all the panelists, and I'm going to go around the room and by the way my screen looks, and I'm going to start with Sarah. She's going to kick us off and explain why we're here, because we're talking about her book series, The Eye of the Beholder.
Thank you so much for putting this together. I'm super excited. My name is Sarah Tarkoff. I am a writer, mostly TV and books. So the book series we're here to talk about is the Eye of the Beholder series, Sinless, Fearless, and Ruthless. It's a YA sci-fi series. I'm also a TV writer. I've written for Arrow, wrote for a show called Mistresses, and wrote an episode of Witches of East End. Most recently, I just started working on Star Trek Strange New Worlds, which I'm very excited about as a bit of a Trekkie. So that's me.
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate that. I'm going to give it over to Amy.
Hi, I'm Amy Lawton. I'm a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Connecticut. I'm writing my dissertation on the bodies that are donated to medical schools for use in dissection, which sounds kind of grisly, but it's actually a really refined and sensitive process around this donation, and that's how it relates to the sociology of religion. And hopefully get to talk a little bit about the sociology of the body as well, since the books we're here to talk about touch on that.
Perfect. Thank you, Amy. And then we're going to give it over to Samantha.
So, hi, everyone. My name is Samantha Restman, and I'm a PhD student at UC San Diego. My research focuses on the spinal cord and the brain, and I look at technology that can interact with both the spinal cord and the brain. And hopefully today I can delve into some of the details of the science behind the nanobots and other aspects of this book.
Thank you, Samantha. Nicole, I'm going to give it to you.
Hi, I'm Nicole Henniger. I'm a professor at Tennessee Tech University in Cookeville, Tennessee. And my research relates to shame and guilt, which is an important topic in this book. So I look at social emotions that are part of how we relate to each other in society, and that you sort of have to either have someone there or have the idea of someone there to feel. So you wouldn't feel ashamed if you were in an island by yourself, unless you were thinking about kind of your social group that you left behind. So it's an interesting way of trying to look at how people interact with social psychology by looking at how people feel and sort of regulate their own social interactions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nicole. All right, we're going to kick it off with some questions for Sarah. So I had the pleasure of meeting Sarah. Was it last year, Sarah?
I think it was 2 years ago.
2 years ago. Oh my God, time flies by. I had the pleasure of meeting her at Comic-Con 2 years ago, where we had a panel on women in the creative world and in science, and it was wonderful. And she's written for some TV shows that I love. So when Sarah said she had a book come out, I had to read it, and I really loved it. But for the people who have not read it, Sarah, can you tell us a little bit more about the book series?
Yes. So as I said, it's a YA sci-fi book. The main character is a 17-year-old girl. It starts off feeling a little bit more utopian than dystopian, where it's this world where about 10 years before the book starts, there's this event where all of a sudden, if you do something bad, you become ugly, to the point where like your throat can close up and you die. If you do something good, you become beautiful. And so everyone's like, okay, so clearly God is, A, God exists, and B, God is punishing and rewarding us for our actions. So we finally live in a just world. Everything's great. This world religion pops up to explain what's happening and sort of help people navigate this new world. They've various prophets who are sort of giving advice on this is what you should do, this is what God wants, things like that. And so our main character, Grace, thinks, well, I'm pretty, so clearly life is fine, things are great, I'm not gonna think too deeply about this. And then, then it's a book, so she discovers, oh, things aren't quite what they seem, and goes down this journey toward discovering what the truth is, and then fighting for what's right. So that's the gist of the book.
Thank you so much. How did you come up with that story? It has so many different angles. It has a science angle in it, it has a religious angle in it, has a little bit of a political angle in it. How did you come up?
So the initial inspiration was a number of years ago, I was pitching to a company that specialized in visual effects involving the human body, so changing people's physical appearances. And at the time, they were trying to sort of make their own movies. I'm not sure that they're still doing that now, but they were seeking pitches where they're like, we want a story that involves changing people's appearances. So that was my starting point, was pitching with that constraint. And I was sort of thinking about different things to pitch in that world. And I remember the book Cat's Cradle. I'm not sure if anyone's read it, the Kurt Vonnegut book, possibly my favorite book of all time. And so in that book, he creates this religion, which, I mean, I guess depending how you read it, maybe you love it, maybe you hate it, but I just really loved this religion, the Bokononism. It's just this like adorable, like, he tells you it's not real, but like, I just really liked it. I really wanted to, I was like, I could be this, I would join this religion. Like, this seems really cool. So I wanted to create, so I was like, okay, how do I combine that idea? I like the idea of creating a religion that I would totally be a part of, that I would be totally on board with. But then, it's not real. And so I combined that idea with changing people's appearances. And that was the genesis of the initial idea. And then, that obviously has a lot of political implications, and, there's a lot of then science behind it. So went a little bit down into researching what would this world be and developing the world, and went from there.
Did you have a specific, it's a young adult book, as you mentioned.
Yes.
Did you have a specific message that you wanted to convey for the young audience in that book?
So it's interesting. I wouldn't say that I had a message. I actually pitched it initially, I conceived it initially as a story for adults. Still with a young character, because that seemed like in this world, you're like, who cares the most about what they look like? Obviously, it's like an insecure teenage girl. But then, as I was sort of developing it, people would sort of say like, this feels a little more YA. And so I ended up taking it in that direction, which is how it ended up. It initially was a script, and then I eventually turned it into a book. So I think, the message is very much, I don't necessarily write things to be like, oh, here's a message, but I think the implication is very much that the obsession with how you look is only skin deep. It is not a, it does not designate your place in society. And also I think, there's obviously a lot of sort of, I wrote the book, almost, I want to say 7 years ago. So was not necessarily thinking about where our culture has gone at this point to, the lack of sort of truth in our society. So I think there is probably a message of, seek out good news sources and seek out truth is probably in there as well. So
thank you for that. I appreciate that. And that brings me to the religious aspect of it. So I'm gonna try not to look at Amy on the screen, but look in the camera. But Amy, as Sarah said, there is she came up with the idea because of a religion concept she read about in another book. Tell us a little bit more about religion as a concept within society.
Sure. So I totally makes total sense that you came up with this with religion as the concept, because it was so clear to me from the outset that this is a religious blueprint, that the story goes way beyond that. There's some cool technology, there's some terrifying technology, but the way the story unfolds is really taking a certain religious outlook towards the world. And as soon as I read the main character's first name, Grace Luther, I thought, well, I already know, you've clued me in a little bit about where you're coming from here. Obviously, that is maybe the most Protestant name I could think of, but it's definitely not Protestantism. And that's what makes it so cool as an invented religion, right? Like, I recognize these parts of it, but it's new and creative. So the reason I totally buy this as a religious story is that religions are a couple of different things. Wherever they pop up in the world, they share a few different characteristics. The first one is that they're the blueprint for how society orders themselves. And people think that they're turning to religion for supernatural explanations of the natural world. And actually, historically, that's not really the case. It's not interesting to ancient people, why does the moon go around the earth? If you can have a better explanation about your society, like, well, when the moon is full, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, right? If you're using it more as a social calendar rather than an explanation about what the gods are doing with the moon, this is a totally fictitious example, but it's a nice sort of general one about there's going to be a social impact to that belief. So religions are the pattern, and then religious groups emerge and change over time, but they usually use components from all the previous religious groups. So one of the things that makes the Great Spirit in Sinless such a compelling God character, even though we never meet him or talk to him or learn anything about what people think of this being, is that it's assimilated all of these previous things, right? So that it's emerged and people are believing it because there's a history of, a certain kind of Christian worship. But you also mentioned that they're doing a Ramadan break fast, right, in the book. So it's become compelling to the people who are involved in it because it's familiar. Americans in particular really do like to switch religious groups, but they don't really ever stop being religious. So that was the third thing that was like very familiar about how our society actually works, is that it's not unbelievable that everyone would become part of this new religion, because 40% of Americans re-affiliate during their lives anyway. So if there was a major event like the revelation in the book, I have no trouble believing that everyone's going to be like, yeah, this is cool. This is what we were doing anyway. Let's all sign up and organize our society along these lines. So yeah, I really enjoyed seeing all of these different strains of religion in the book.
Thank you. I find it interesting. You say that, historically we've used religion to kind of set the social norms and make sense of our society. But when you look at the world today, there's so many different religions. Just in America, you have the new Christians, but within the new Christians, there's all of these little different arms, and you have your more traditional ones like the Catholic and the Protestants. So do people just like to switch because whatever social norm is being done in one religion doesn't fit them anymore? So they'll just say, let's create something new? Or how does all that work?
So in general, you convert because someone you were close to converted. So something happens in a person's life and they sort of, drag a little group along with them. These are the new religious movements that are brand new movements. They usually get called cults. Give them 150 years and they'll be religious traditions. It's just a matter of sticking around.
And is that counting, that 40%, is that counting people that move to something like spiritual but not religious, or like a sort of non-affiliated kind of thing, or?
So that doesn't count that number, which is from the general social survey data in, I want to say 2015. I'm an academic, so I have to just like practice citing it, even though no one cares what year it was. But that's almost more of an almost a separate question, right? That's like the de-affiliation, like you're saying, I'm not going to have anything to do with religion anymore. Spiritual but not religious, very common and yet very poorly understood, because it's so new and we have so little data on it compared to the major groups.
Sarah, I think we have to do a little bit more spoiler on the book, because
Yeah, please.
I would like to delve a little bit into the concept of people, depending on what moral choices they make, they get uglier and sick, or they get more beautiful. I'm going to give it away.
Are we gonna go to shame next? Is that our next topic?
I was going to go to the nanobots.
Okay, great.
That ties kind of together the shame and stuff. So
I'll do a couple spoilers.
Okay. Yes.
So two things. One is the first way that Grace finds out that things aren't quite what they seem is she finds these pills, which you can take to prevent the punishment, your appearance changing. And so all of a sudden she can do bad things without any sort of negative response. And then ultimately what she finds out is the reason that is happening is that when this all began, everyone now has this nanotechnology in their brains, which is reading the negative emotions in their brains associated with shame and guilt. So if they do something bad, then they feel shame. The nanotechnology in their brain senses that shame and guilt and responds by physically altering their body, by sending out signals, which, change their hormones, change their, just are able to affect the physical health of their body. So the way that these pills work is by counteracting the second half of that, to essentially not let them be harmed.
Which of course brings up the question for me on nanobots. Samantha, you work in the field of nanobots. Is that a possible thing? Could we have nanobots in our brain that pick up on chemicals and then change the rest of our body?
So I think it's a really fascinating idea, and we're definitely moving towards something like this. However, we are, thankfully, I would say, still quite a bit away from actually being able to implement this. But I think this is a really cool topic, because there are two aspects of this technology that I want to kind of delve into. One is the actual alteration of physical appearance, and the other one is the being able for these nanobots to be able to actually pick up and understand people's behavior and people's emotions, right? So right now, I think we're closer to the first, to actually realizing the physical appearance aspect. A lot of research is being done in the fields of like nanoparticles, and which is could be considered a type of nanobot, I guess, where especially for cancer treatment, there's a lot of interest in developing technology that will target specific cells and specific cell types and only affect those cells. Right now, like chemotherapy affects all your cells in your entire body, and which is really damaging. So there is a lot of interest in developing technology that can target specific cells. And so in my vision of this nanobot physical appearance change, you would actually be targeting specific cell types like your skin or your teeth, right, or your throat. So in that sense, we are kind of getting there, but the targeting ability is still pretty limited. Like I read a paper where less than 1% of all the molecules or all the nanoparticles that were injected into some patient, only less than 1% actually made it to the target, this tumor. In that case, it was a cancer tumor. So we are interested in it. However, it's still quite a bit away from actually being able to realize it. And then there's also questions of, if it's in your bloodstream, then your blood gets cleaned in your kidneys, and so some of those nanobots might be escaping. So are they regenerating on their own, or are they being given to you like through your food? Like there might be some other aspect of this that is really interesting to think about. And then there's the other side, which is the side of the actual communication with the brain and understanding the shame and the guilt. So my understanding is that these pills, they like the pills that you can take to prevent this, or generally speaking, these nanobots can kind of pick up on the chemical signals in your brain. So there are chemicals so when neurons kind of act in your, fire in your brain, different neurons can kind of correspond or like relate to different chemicals. So, neuron firing is kind of correlated to different levels of chemicals in your brain. So in that sense, the nanobots in your brain could pick up different concentrations in specific brain regions. And I know that there's been research done that shows that like if someone is, like there have been studies on, I think it was like MRI studies where different regions of your brain are active or more active when you are, for example, feeling guilt or feeling shame or making decisions about, what's right and wrong. So technically speaking, you could have some technology that's able to pick up this information, this activity, this chemical signaling, and actually read it as a, decision-making process or as a shame, feeling of shame. But what really interests me though is that kind of less technically, I do feel like different people would probably have slightly different interpretations of what is good and bad. And so I'm really curious to kind of know, would each person have a different, would be affected differently physically? Like if two people do the same somewhat questionable, morally questionable thing, would one of them be affected more than the other, right? So that's something that I'm personally really interested in kind of thinking about. But yeah, overall, there is technology that is kind of related to what these nanobots can do, but we still have a lot of ways to actually achieve that.
I'm kind of thankful for that. We're still a little bit of ways off of that, I'm not going to lie. But that brings us for a good question for Nicole is on the shame and guilt feeling. So while the nanobots might not quite be there to change our appearance or our bodies when we feel shame and guilt, I think there is a component that actually affects us physically when we have negative emotions. Can you explain that a little bit for us, Nicole?
Yeah, so it is the case that we still don't know exactly how to differentiate between different emotions. So like there is no emotion center of the brain. Like there's areas of the brain that are often involved with emotions. Like we often bring up the amygdala, for example, but it's involved with a lot of different emotions and non-emotional processes. So there is no emotion center of the brain. And the same thing with our physiological responses. So our body's response to emotion, there's not a specific pattern for shame and a specific pattern for guilt and a specific pattern for anger. Usually what happens is just that we get generally activated. So our sympathetic nervous system, our fight or flight system turns on because usually we're having an emotion in response to something we need to deal with. So the canonical example is you see a bear and what happens? What do you need to do? Like, well, we have evolved that automatically what happens is energy floods to our muscles, our heart starts pounding, we stop digesting, we tamp down our immune system because we don't need that in that moment. That's not the threat. The threat is I need to get away from this bear. And so all of our systems sort of focus on that fight or flight in the moment. What do I do? Fight, flight, or freeze is another response we can have in that state. But the problem is for us in modern everyday life, we don't really encounter bears so much anymore. I mean, maybe out in California you do, but generally we don't. And so instead we have this stress response chronically. So if you're feeling ashamed or guilty, you might be having this sort of amped up response over and over and over again. Shame and guilt tends to make us focus on what we did, and we tend to think about it a lot. So it changes the way we think along with the way that our body is responding, and then that creates this loop where we keep thinking about it and keep responding to it. And so stress over time can have direct effects on the body. So by tamping down the immune system, it can make you more likely to get sick. Or by keeping your heart rate elevated, it can make you more likely to have your heart run out. And so there's these direct effects, but also it can have indirect effects where it makes you do things to cope with those feelings. So maybe you drink more, or you sleep less, or you do less things that are good for your body. And that in turn also has an effect on your health and on your appearance. And so it is the case that these negative emotions can have effects both directly and indirectly on your appearance. Maybe not through nanobots, but it's kind of our own way of refocusing that physically.
I think that's interesting because, especially when you look at it with religion, right? So I have a lot of anxiety, and for me, it's oftentimes based in shame and guilt. And religion kind of often, at least in some of the religion, the being guilted into something or being made feel guilty because you did something wrong is a big part of religion, right? At the same time, oftentimes, one of the solutions to help with anxiety is to kind of learn to let go, and maybe, let's say, there's a higher meaning in the universe or a higher being or whatever, and it's let go of that worry because it's all sort of taken care of. So a lot of people in anxiety turn to religion, and I think that's an interesting kind of, for me, it creates a feedback loop. I'm like, wait, but you might make me feel guilty again. So and I thought that was interesting in the book because the religion was created sort of to explain the nanobots and the people being beautiful and not beautiful, and the guilt and the shame. But it's not only to explain that, but I think also to keep that moral code going, right? The world is different. There's less attacks on people. There's less violence in the world. So I was wondering how easy it is to separate religion from politics.
I wouldn't try. I mean, that's my first answer is it wouldn't be something I would attempt. Even with nanobots, I probably wouldn't try it. Even if you were able to focus on that part of your brain and isolate it. Religions. It's funny that you mentioned that, there are these two distinct responses to religion, right? That people find so much comfort and so much guilt in religion. And in some ways, I would say that, it's hard to look at and make it make sense, but it also is very deeply intuitive to a lot of people that, well, of course, if you're going to get something really good out of it, you have to live up to that, right? They sort of perceive it as an exchange. And I think that exchange quality is something that links religion to politics and doesn't separate it from politics, right? That we're all going to feel good and patriotic and if our country is doing these good things, and we can pat ourselves on the back about it, and we're going to feel kind of crummy if something bad is happening, and maybe, you don't want to think about protests or injustice because that makes you complicit. So, while I certainly would not be making the case that politics is a religion, I would say that it's pretty closely patterned on some of the same things that are important about human society that we would expect to see it maybe mimic religion in that way. And it definitely explains why some people would love politics and hate politics, right? Is that you're going to have these two sort of legitimate responses to it.
That's really cool. And I will say, without giving too many spoilers, book 2 of the series does have a very contentious election where the political parties are just the various religious groups in the resistance. So I've
got to read that. I haven't read it.
So yes, very much, we're in the same wavelength there.
That's interesting because I think, with religion, so you can have shame and guilt, of course, with zero religious beliefs, right? It's just based on what you feel is a social transgression or not. And you can even feel ashamed or guilty over something you genuinely don't think is wrong, right? So you can sort of, really it's a reaction to potential ostracism. It's a reaction to going against your social group's code that could get you kicked out of the group, which of course, long term is a really bad thing for you. And so if you make that kind of mistake, even if you don't personally feel like it's wrong, you need to fix it. And definitely if you personally feel like it's wrong, you want to fix it. And so it can be something where with religion, it gives you a way to fix it that you don't have to directly act on kind of what your act was. You can ask for forgiveness without actually having to necessarily fix the thing that went wrong. Because one of the problems with shame and guilt is it's great when you can fix the thing that you did wrong. So if you hurt someone, if you can, somehow fix it, that's the motivation of the shame and guilt. And that's great, and that's good, and that's the whole point of it. Or you could be motivated to avoid, so just try to get away from the situation and not engage with it. And to some extent that could work too. But what if you can't avoid it and also you can't fix it? What do you do? And so I think kind of one of the attractions of religion for being able to deal with shame and guilt is, okay, if I can pray, or if I can, say a rosary, or do whatever it takes to kind of make up for this thing that I did, then that can, be like, okay, now the balance is clean and I don't have to feel this emotion anymore.
So actually, one thing I wanted to ask about is, so I know that, like, I mean, typically in kind of religions, my understanding is that, a lot of you kind of throughout your life, you do things that are good and bad. And then at the end, there's like a judgment, or there's, a chance for redemption, or, you're condemned to hell, for example, right? But in this case, the effects of, and throughout your life, there aren't really that many direct effects based on your behavior. But in this case, you have a direct impact immediately. It's your physical appearance. So it's not like you have a chance, it's not like it's possible that, there is no religion, or it's possible that nothing's going to happen to you. Here, there's an immediate impact, which is, your physical appearance changes. So perhaps you don't even have as much time to feel shame and guilt because you feel like fear, for example, right? Like maybe there are other emotions that might come into play based on this immediate effect of your appearance, right?
That makes sense. I was also thinking about the religion and politics aspect as maybe sort of almost the same flip sides of the same coin, which is personal identifiers of I identify, my religion then becomes a part of my personal identity, becomes a part of the group that I identify myself with. And, in the same way that I could be like, I'm a member of this political party, or, whatever the various identifiers could be. So then it just, it's just one more way that we can sort of say, this is who I am and this is where I belong.
The whole guilt and morality issue of the book is an interesting one because of the nanobots. The way that I read it, the nanobots were created to actually affect a good change in society, right? To make people more adhere to doing good things, to find a way to reduce wars and conflicts in countries. Nevertheless, the technology used and developed for that is still controlling people. So as a scientist, when you develop new technology like nanobots, how much of ethical thinking goes into the process? Or is it more of it doesn't matter what I create, anything I can create could be used for either good or bad? So do scientists take the chance to think about consequences?
In my experience, they do. So I'm sure maybe you also have had this, but everyone at our university, for example, needs to be trained on research ethics and ethics involving, technology. So I know that there is an emphasis on, well, maybe not necessarily like stopping you from pursuing a certain field, but really considering all the impacts of that particular, that technology or that research that you're doing, right? Like if it's successful, can it be used for like bad things? For example, can it be used as a weapon, right? For an army purpose? So the real question, I think, this is kind of more philosophical, but like, at what point is the researcher responsible for their technology versus, future applications? Because oftentimes I feel like it's hard to really, especially because research is so incremental, like people, make advancements based on previous research. It is kind of hard to really foresee all the implications and all the impacts of your work, right?
Can I jump in here about scientific ethics? This is part of what I'm studying. So I mentioned I'm researching the whole body donors to medical schools. And there's a culture around this, just sort of like folk stories and that people tell about terrible things that have been done to cadavers in medical schools, that, things that have been very disrespectful. People steal heads and hands and give them stupid names and pose them. And as far as I can tell, this is not part of the modern landscape, right? I'm sure there are some people who say really tactless things, because such is life. But the ethics training that goes into, if you're going to work with a human body at any level, and it's given rise to this entire culture of, we memorialize them, we thank them, we write letters to the family, and it never becomes just a body, right? It's always a practice of ethics, that it's not just a course you take and a certificate you get, but it's how you treat anything human as a person. And I think that really speaks to, what do we sort of hope to expect from scientists, and can we create that culture? I would say, at least in the case that I'm studying, yes, we're creating a culture of great ethical care.
Yeah, I'd say psychology also is very concerned with ethics, because it's not so much with what the research is used for. So I think that's an interesting thing. I mentioned, so I'm a research psychologist. Kind of my goal is to find truth, right? To find information for the sake of finding information, not with any particular application in mind, usually. There are researchers who are applied researchers who have a particular application in mind, but that research can be applied in a lot of different ways. So it can be used in counseling to help people. It can be used in marketing to sell people things. It can be used in writing to create believable characters, right? It can be used in a lot of different ways. We write somewhat about those applications when we're trying to get grants for our work, or trying to sell the work to people, but it's not necessarily the goal, and it's not something that we think, okay, well, this could be used for evil, but also for good, and you can't really control the outcome once the information is out there.
I think that's why I like pop culture so much. And sometimes I think maybe the scientists who work on a new technology or something that, like you said, could be used for good or evil, sometimes you just don't know. Maybe they could run it by storytellers and see where would they take the story, because oftentimes pop culture, comics and books have sort of been the mirror for society of, okay, if you do this, these are the possible consequences. So maybe, maybe there should be a two-way street, not only the writers asking the scientists whether the science is right, but maybe also the scientists asking the writers, saying, okay, if we have this, how could you imagine this going? Has that ever happened, Sarah, that somebody came to you and said, what if?
Not explicitly in that way, but it's interesting. I think in general, it's easier for a storyteller to think of all the things that could go wrong instead of all the things that could go right. It's much more interesting and easier to write a dystopia because it has internal conflicts. Whereas once you create a utopia, it's like, well,
yeah, that's boring. Who wants to read that?
Yeah, and I think, Star Trek, we were talking about, it's sort of one of the few worlds that's been able to do that, because yes, it's this utopian world where we've sort of solved all of our scarcity problems, but also now it gets to be this adventure story, and we sort of go out and find the obstacles, as opposed to the obstacles being inherent within the society. So I think that the technology sort of allows us access to go somewhere new, and then maybe find a dystopian planet that then we have a problem on a dystopian planet. So all of that to say, I think I spend a lot of time when I'm working on something thinking about, what is the story that I'm telling about this technology? And I think it is sometimes hard to not just repeat the same stories in terms of, oh, well, here's this new technology and it's scary and it's going to destroy the world and therefore we shouldn't have this technology. It's like, what's the way to tell a story that is about those ethics but isn't sort of anti-science? And I think that's where I sort of think about it. That's what I think about a lot.
Yeah, it is about the story, right? First and foremost. So there has to be some conflict that its results. That makes perfect sense. And you might have noticed this panel is made up all of amazing women. I'm really excited about that. You have picked a female hero, a heroine, I think is the English word for that. How much does that mean for you? That is
So,
5 minute.
I will admit, is that our 5 minute warning?
Yes.
Well, I will admit, when I first pitched this story, I pitched it with a 17-year-old girl protagonist because that seemed like the protagonist that fit the story. And this was 10 years ago or so, and their first note was like, can you make it like a 30-year-old man, because that makes it easier to makes it easier to cast, because that's, and obviously that movie didn't end up getting made, but so I'm happy in that sense. I think most importantly for me, because I think the protagonist better fits the story, and that's the most important thing to me. But also, I like, there are not, I think YA has really opened up a place for women, especially, young women, to see themselves reflected in science fiction, which isn't necessary, and reflected truthfully, and not just necessarily as, the object of a male fantasy. And I think that's, it's been very meaningful for me to be a part of that, I would say. Just to a part of that genre.
So with our 5 minute warning coming up, I want to ask if there's any parting wisdom that you would like to share with the audience that will be watching this video. It can be anything. It could be related to the book. It could be related to your job. It could be whatever you would like to share before we close this session out.
I'll start. I would say, particularly talking to anyone who's interested in writing science fiction, that the more you can do the research and talk to the people who know the real science and sociology and psychology of the world that you're building, the easier it'll be. Like, I think with in the research that I did, it gave me more ideas and places for the story to go than it restricted me. And I think that, I honestly wish that I had met all of you prior to writing these books. I feel like you would have had so many interesting, I feel like we've had so many interesting conversations that would have been really useful to everything in those books. So those are my parting words of wisdom.
Anybody else? Especially maybe for some of the young audience that might be watching us and who might have a budding interest in science.
I think if you're interested in literature, you're probably also interested in psychology. So it's something that you don't have to be a researcher to learn about it. There's lots of great books out there, great articles that have been written, and I think kind of giving that common language is helpful. Where as you're reading, then, so like as I was reading the book, I was just like, oh, like there's cognitive dissonance, there's the halo effect, there's this, there's that, and it sort of helps you understand your world more. So I appreciate that it was a good reflection of a lot of those psychological ideas, and it's something that I think everybody has access to. It applies to any field.
And I'll second that. Sorry, you go.
Go ahead.
I was saying, and if you're interested in writing, you should also read about psychology, because everything you just mentioned is useful. Sorry, go ahead.
I just was going to dovetail on what Nicole said, that, one of the coolest things about staying in education, which I'm in like 40th grade or something, right? Like it's been a long haul to get to the PhD candidate stage, but you start to accumulate so many interesting references, and you see them reflected in art, and think like, wow, that's just so amazing that I get to be part of this world that's producing this knowledge and consuming it and using it to entertain and using it to inspire. And I want to end on the note of inspiration, because as much as a dystopia can really make you anxious and depressed to read about, the idea that we are capable agents who can do something in the face of a world that seems completely stacked against us is, I think, the core not just of science fiction and literature and psychology and sociology and all technology endeavors, right? But that we are humans is an amazing thing to explore on any level, and you can just pick it up and run with it, whatever's grabbing your fancy.
That's awesome. Go ahead, Samantha.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, so one of the reasons why I got interested in science was because of all the interesting, stories and movies and TV shows that I was watching when I was younger. And I think that you know, if you have a chance and, you know, you're a fan of a book or something, take a moment and think about, you know, the way that that book was created and all the aspects and differences between that world and your world. And, you know, think about the science and the, you know, technology in it, like I did. And, you know, you can kind of start reading about it on the internet now that there's so much stuff available on the internet. There's always something you can read about and like learn more about. So yeah, definitely take a moment when you're reading something or watching something to do that.
I think that's great advice, not for all ages, actually, not for the young ones. I think if you find something that's interesting, read up on it, make sure you have some credible sources. Those are wonderful parting gifts for the audience. Thank you so much. And with that, unfortunately, we already came up on the time. I don't know how 45 minutes can fly by so fast, but they sure did. Please follow the Fleet Science Center. You can find us on the web, fleetscience.org, and we are on all the social media platform with the handle @FleetScience. And Sarah, how can we find best you and your books?
My Twitter handle is @Sarah Tarkoff. The books are available from Harper Voyager and your local bookstore and anywhere you would buy books.
Wonderful. Then I hope you all go out. If you haven't read the books yet, go read the books. And with that, I want to thank our wonderful panelists today. Thank you so much for your time, your expertise, and your passion. And I hope we'll see you all again soon. Bye, everybody.
Bye.